The Empire State, one of the most lived-in states in the entire American Union, birthed back in the days of the 13 colonies. New York State has a history worth exploring. The earliest known inhabitants of what we know today as the state of New York were indigenous tribes of ancient times. Estimated to have made their home in the area all the way back around 10,000 BC, Native Americans spent centuries within New York's boundaries, and additional tribes, such as the Iroquois, would migrate from surrounding regions to join them. By the time of European exploration on America's East Coast, a handful of indigenous tribes called New York their home, and could be divided into two categories: the Iroquoian-speaking tribes and the Algonquin-speaking tribes. The former grouping included tribes such as the Seneca, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, and Cayuga, while the latter described others like the Lenni Lenape, Mohegan, and Wappinger tribes. The indigenous populations of this region had developed quite sophisticated systems of economy, farming, and culture, as well as a significant alliance deemed the Iroquoian Confederacy. None of this, however, mattered much to the Europeans when they foreseeably made their way to the eastern coast of the New World. There were two explorers who first stumbled across the New York lands, but can't be credited with doing much upon their arrival. In 1524, a French-employed Italian explorer by the name of Giovanni da Verrazzano was sailing along the Atlantic when he found himself in what we know today as the New York Harbor, and eventually modern-day Manhattan. He wrote of his exploration, but did little more in the way of colonizing New York than that. And the same could be said for Jacques Cartier, a French explorer who made similar explorations in 1535. It wasn't until another man, one Henry Hudson, under the employment of the Dutch East India Company, made his way to New York in 1609 that colonization became an intention. Quite a few years after the others, but unlike the others, his goal was, on behalf of the Dutch, to create the beginnings of a colony. Thus, in 1614, the Dutch built the first ever European settlement within the borders of today's New York. Fort Nassau, constructed under the watchful eye of Hendrik Christiansen, was located near modern-day Albany and had the main purpose of being a trading post, particularly for the booming fur trade. By the mid-1620s, a few dozen Dutch families had migrated to the new colony as merchants and were encouraged to make the move. The budding colony was given the moniker of New Netherlands, and by 1624, what we know today as New York was founded as New Amsterdam. A new, more permanent settlement, Fort Orange, would further replace Fort Nassau as the Dutch headquarters in New York, and immigrants from across Europe were already flocking to the new colony and promise of a new, better life. The problem for the Dutch, however, was that the English wanted what the Dutch had. In the midst of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the entire colony of New Netherlands fell into England's hands and was renamed New York. The city of New Amsterdam was also unimaginatively given the refreshed name of New York, though this was retaken by the Dutch in 1673 during the Third Anglo-Dutch War. Instead of restoring the city's old name, the Dutch called it New Orange for a year, until they lost it to the English again. One city aside, though, the colony now named New York was still growing under its new ownership. When the English had taken over, the settlement hosted an estimated maximum of 8,000 residents. Roughly a century later, it would be home to around 168,000. As was the case at the start, Many Europeans fled their homelands for the New World as a result of famine, religious persecution, economic woes, or other troubles in their homeland. Some were simply looking for new opportunities and a better chance at a good life. New York's economy was quite a success, agriculture being a particularly important factor. The colonists were doing quite well, and many grew to tolerate their indigenous neighbors, but others didn't. The French, who had their own colonial ambitions in the surrounding area, had sponsored multiple Catholic missions that extended into the borders of today's New York. Religious and merchant endeavors led them into direct conflict with the British, but it also led them to form some important friendships with native tribes. Tensions eventually boiled over into the French and Indian War, which saw the indigenous fight alongside both the Brits and the French, and an eventual British victory leading to the loss of France's territory on New York soil in 1763. But as the idea of independence from the British began to swirl around America's 13 colonies, one could feel the vibrations of war rattling the air already. With the controversial Stamp Act of 1763, New York shot to the forefront of the independence movement in the colonies with the help of the Sons of Liberty. Despite some New Yorkers opposing the idea of breaking free from their British overlords, there was little to do to stop the downward spiral now. War was on the horizon. One could only hope it would go smoothly. Almost 1/3 of every battle fought in the American Revolution was done so on New York's battered ground. General George Washington spent much attention on the fight for New York, and when independence was declared in the summer of 1776, New York had endorsed the Declaration. Although the British would hold New York City captive for the entirety of the war, the locals fought hard to free their territory in its entirety nonetheless. When the war finally ended and all of New York was restored to the Americans, the recaptured city of NYC would serve a short term as the capital of the nation, after New York State would be the 11th to ratify the new United States Constitution. The 1777 Constitution of New York had, in fact, served as quite an inspiration for the federal Constitution in 1788. Similarly, New York City was the capital of the state, not just the country, off and on until 1797, when New Yorkers shifted their metropolis to Albany. Many of America's important moments throughout history took place in New York. The Bill of Rights was written up in the state's borders. George Washington was inaugurated as America's first president in NYC. The U.S. Supreme Court was birthed there. The founding of the New York Stock Exchange, of course, happened in the state, and so many other crucial events. The War of 1812 would use New York as a battleground, just as the Revolution had. New York was growing still in so many ways. As time went on, the state was relying less and less on agriculture for success. New transportation creations involving steamboats and trains made New York a convenient place for travel, and the opening of the Erie Canal added another boost of attraction. Natives at this time were now secluded to a dozen reservations, whilst others had been sent into exile or died for their decision to support the British in the Revolutionary War. Alongside these reservations sat a growing list of towns, businesses, schools, farms, churches, theaters, athletics, and a building mood of abolitionism. By the mid-19th century, the governor of New York, William H. Seward, worked with the state's legislature to protect and expand the rights of both runaway slaves and free blacks within the state. The state, though hosting some hesitant Democrats, thus quickly joins the efforts of Abraham Lincoln with the outbreak of the Civil War, and New York ultimately would supply more manpower than any other northern state for the fighting effort. Quite unlike the Revolutionary War, however, not a single battle broke out on New York soil. There was, however, significant unrest from the locals in 1863 when the Union pushed forth a draft law that required all male citizens between the ages of 20 and 35 and single males up to the age of 45 to be eligible for a draft. You could pay your way out of the conscription, but not every New Yorker could afford that. Mid-July saw an outbreak of massive and rather violent protests deemed the draft riots across NYC. These demonstrations were led predominantly by ethnic Irish New Yorkers and often targeted Black Americans and their communities, causing a notable exodus of the latter from certain areas. The unrest fizzled out when the North opted to allow some Black Americans to fight in their own regiments, calming fears from European Americans that the draft was taking their own jobs away and giving them to the free Black men. With the war's end, then came more immigration and more freedom for Black New Yorkers. A large portion still of New York's growing population was European, with many immigrants coming from Germany, Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. But there was also a curious number of Chinese immigrants arriving around 1850. New York was becoming increasingly diverse and exceedingly prosperous as a state, with more workers flooding in. By the turn of the 20th century, the population of New York State had exceeded 7 million. These millions of New Yorkers would see the events of the 1900s, from the World Wars and the Great Depression to the start of the modern era. Today, New York remains one of the most populous states in the US and one of the nation's most popular tourist attractions. Modern-day New Yorkers have seen tragedy and triumph of their own, and their ancestors could say the same. The history of New York State is deeply intertwined with that of its country, and without New York, who knows what the United States would be like today.